New student Starfish. Chapter 3. At 9 o'clock, the students filed into Mrs. Puff's classroom. They all took seats at the far end of the room, as far away from the teacher as possible. Sammy the shark sat next to Susie the salmon and began to play a game of Go Fish. Franco the flounder took out the latest comic book adventure of Merman Man and Barnacle Boy and began to read. The rest of the students put their heads on their desks and promptly dozed off. SpongeBob took out his pencil and sharpened it to a point. Then he opened his spiral-bound notebook and turned to a clean page. Patrick did the same. "Hello, class," said Mrs. Puff, a large spotted pufferfish wearing a red dress. "I see we have a new student today." She smiled warmly at Patrick. "Young man, please stand up and introduce yourself." "Who's the fat kid talking to?" Patrick whispered to SpongeBob. "She's talking to you, Patrick! She's the teacher!" SpongeBob hissed. Mrs. Puff cleared her throat. "Excuse me, no whispering, SpongeBob. You have to set a good example for our new pupil," she said and turned to Patrick. "Go ahead, tell us your name. Don't be shy." Patrick stood up and turned around. He stared out at the sea of blank faces. Patrick's knees began to knock together, sweat beads formed on his upper lip and trickled down the sides of his face. Patrick stammered. He was so nervous that he couldn't even remember his own name. Peter? No, that's not right, he thought. Pedro? Paco? Pierre? He ran down a list of names that started with the letter P, but none of them sounded familiar. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Patrick noticed the calendar hanging on the wall. The date was the 24th of August. My name is 24, Patrick blurted out. The students howled with laughter. Patrick just shrugged and quietly returned to his seat. "Oh, great, another genius," Mrs. Puff mumbled under her breath. "Settle down, class," she commanded. "Today's lesson will be about how to turn a boat." Mrs. Puff began to draw a detailed diagram on the chalkboard. SpongeBob nudged Patrick with his elbow. "Hey, Patrick, do you know what's even funnier than 24? He whispered. "No, what?" Patrick asked. SpongeBob stifled a giggle. 25! he said and burst out laughing. Patrick snorted and snickered. Then SpongeBob chuckled. Soon the two erupted in uncontrollable laughter. Patrick held his belly, guffawing loudly. SpongeBob slid onto the floor and rolled around in a fit of hysterics. But Mrs. Puff didn't find SpongeBob and Patrick funny at all. "Young man," she said to Patrick, "this is your first day of school, so I'll let you off with a warning. As for you, SpongeBob, I expected more from a good noodle. And for someone who has failed his boarding test 39 times, I suggest you pay attention." SpongeBob hung his head ashamed and concentrated on copying the diagram from the chalkboard. Patrick leaned over his desk and drew a picture. He folded it and passed it to SpongeBob. It was an unflattering drawing of Mrs. Puff. Across the top he had scrawled, "Big Fat Meanie." "Big Fat Meanie?" SpongeBob read aloud. "Patrick, you can't write that about the teacher!" he scolded. Mrs. Puff raised her eyebrows. "What about the teacher?" she said with a scowl. She marched over to SpongeBob's desk and snatched the picture from his hand. "Oh no!" SpongeBob gasped. He tried to grab the piece of paper back, but it was too late. "Oh my!" Mrs. Puff said with a huff. She peered at the drawing. "As if I really look like this!" Mrs. Puff crumbled the paper into a ball. She narrowed her eyes and looked right at SpongeBob. Then she spun around and stomped toward the good noodle board. SpongeBob watched the scene as if it were happening in slow motion. "No!" he shrieked. He shut his eyes and covered his ears, but he could not deny what was about to happen. Mrs. Puff glared at SpongeBob. "SpongeBob, I believe you know the punishment for 2 classroom disruptions," she said sourly. "Your behavior will cost you 1 gold star." She ripped a gold star from beside SpongeBob's name. "Ah, no, SpongeBob cried. He banged his fist on his desk. stood up, spun around, and then fainted onto the floor. Patrick leaned over and slapped his friend's face. "Wake up, SpongeBob!" Patrick shouted in his ear. Startled, SpongeBob's eyelids fluttered open. "If one wishes to be a good noodle, one must behave like a good noodle," Mrs. Puff chided. "I am a good noodle! I am a good noodle! I am a good noodle!" SpongeBob chanted. SpongeBob had always been the most earnest student at boating school, if not the most talented. He prided himself on sitting straight in his seat, paying close attention and taking detailed notes. The loss of a gold star was a blemish on his near-perfect academic record. "You'll get your star back when you earn it," Mrs. Puff said, ignoring SpongeBob's antics and continuing her lesson. "As I was saying, the first thing you need to learn about turning a boat is..." Patrick yawned. "Oh, isn't nap time yet?" he interrupted. Mrs. Puff spun around. "SpongeBob! I've had enough of this behavior!" she shouted. "Collect your things and move to the desk in the back of the room." SpongeBob couldn't believe his ears. "Me? But why?" he stammered. Mrs. Puff puffed up bigger and bigger with rage. She towered over SpongeBob's desk and took a deep breath. "Because the big, fat meanie says so!" she boomed. SpongeBob's skinny legs shook with fear as he slid out from behind his desk. SpongeBob's shoulders sagged and his head dropped. He turned toward the back of the room and began his long walk of shame. When SpongeBob had almost reached the back of the room, he looked back over his shoulder at Mrs. Puff with puppy dog eyes, hoping she'd feel sorry for him and change her mind. Mrs. Puff glared back at him with "don't even try it" eyes. "Oh, barnacles," SpongeBob sighed. "Thanks a lot, Patrick," he said as he shuffled past his friend's desk. "Oh, you're welcome, SpongeBob," Patrick said innocently, not knowing he had done anything wrong. "Anytime, pal." The back of the room was very, very far from the front. SpongeBob could barely hear what Mrs. Puff was saying. "Yodeling-hee-ho!" SpongeBob yodeled. And "Yodeling-hee-ho!" his voice echoed back. SpongeBob took his seat at an isolated desk known as Skid Row. The desk was dingy and decrepit and covered in graffiti. Someone had carved "School is for chumps" into the desk with a fishing hook that was still stuck there. "What kind of student sits here?" SpongeBob worried aloud. I guess I could be... I guess I could still be a good noodle from way back here," he said hopefully, though his eyes filled with tears. "When turning left," Mrs. Puff continued, "you must switch on your left turn signal at least 40 feet from the turn. Look both ways to ensure there aren't any obstacles in your path. Firmly grasp the wheel and rotate it counterclockwise. Patrick turned around in his chair. "Psst! SpongeBob!" SpongeBob turned his face away. Just ignore him," SpongeBob thought to himself. Patrick ripped a piece of paper from his notebook, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it at SpongeBob. "Psst! Hey, SpongeBob! Over here!" "Whatever you do, don't look at him," SpongeBob instructed himself. "Doo-da-doo," he whistled as he twiddled his thumbs. Patrick chewed a small bit of paper, pushed it into a straw, and blew a spitball at SpongeBob. Whack! It landed right between SpongeBob's eyes. No reaction. Patrick launched another spitball that stuck to SpongeBob's long nose, and another, and then 3 more. Covered in spitballs, SpongeBob still would not look in Patrick's direction. Determined not to miss a word Mrs. Puff wrote on the chalkboard, SpongeBob wiped the sticky goo from around his eyes and continued taking notes. Finally, Patrick threw a heavy textbook that landed squarely on SpongeBob's head. "Psst! Hey, SpongeBob! I'm trying to tell you something very important!" "What?" SpongeBob shouted at last. Patrick waved. "Hi!" Just as SpongeBob was about to explode, the bell for recess rang. Ring! Stay tuned for Chapter 4, coming up soon.